Right, good afternoon on this Tuesday, the 20th of January, 2026. We started the year off with a bang, all sorts of global geopolitical developments. But for today's discussion, we're focusing local and domestic, specifically on the province of KwaZulu-Natal, what will be one of the most important provinces in the next local government elections, and indeed one of the most important provinces for South Africa's economy. It is vital that KZN gets moving in terms of service delivery, getting investment into the province, getting growth and job creation going. In the context of all of that, of course, you need some kind of stable provincial government with the right people in the right positions, sending the right signals to investors in South Africa as well as around the world. Now, joining us to discuss the latest developments in the KZN Government of Provincial Unity, the GPU, we are joined by independent analyst, regular author at the Daily Friend and other publications such as Biz News, Mr. Sean McLaughlin. Sean, thank you very much for your time. First of many appearances this year. This will be the first of many appearances on the CRA YouTube channel. I'm going to emphasize before we start, the situation is very fluid. As we record, there's developments coming out in terms of who's getting what position and games of brinkmanship and all this sort of thing. So just before we start, and I give you the first question, earlier this month, the National Freedom Party, so the NFP, they signaled that they intended to leave the Government of Provincial Unity in KZN. At this point in time, the GPU holds a slim 41-seat majority in the 80-seat provincial chamber. So the GPU is composed of the NFP, they've got 1 seat, the ANC has 14 seats, the IFP has 15 seats, and the DA has 11 seats. I guess it's not the elephant in the room, but we should mention that the biggest single party in KwaZulu-Natal is, of course, the Umkhonto weSizwe party. They have 37 seats by themselves in the provincial legislature. So should this Government of Provincial Unity fall apart or shift, MK stands to benefit. But Sean, I'm going to give you, hand over to you. Can you set a bit of the scene here? Do you think this is pure just brinkmanship on the part of the NFP, trying to see what how they can parlay their 1 seat into more lucrative positions, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that may explain to a large extent what is happening here. Now, I think it's helpful to paint a brief picture of this sort of historical context of how this came to be. Now, in late 2023, former President Jacob Zuma announced that he would not any longer be standing for the ANC, and he started his own political party, which you mentioned, Umkhonto weSizwe MK. Now, he's quite a smart man. 6 months before an election is possibly the optimal time to start a new political party because you have momentum. So when it came to the May, June of 24, MK almost got an outright majority in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, 47% of the seats, and the EFF got about 2% of the seats. Now, the MK and EFF together still could not form an outright majority. And with this one seat party, the NFP, who got 0.5% of the votes in KwaZulu-Natal, even if they went with MK and the EFF, that still would not have made 51%. That's the key point here. So those mathematics, those numbers obviously still stand because the makeup of the provincial government hasn't changed. So collectively, the Inkatha Freedom Party, the IFP, the ANC, the DA, and the NFP are collectively able to deny MK and EFF the province. So collectively, those 4 parties have, as you say, 41 seats out of the 80-seat chamber in the province. Now, yeah, that stands as a simple majority, just about, very, very slim. Now, so I guess that provincial government was formed in mid sort of 24, and there was some sort of rumblings, some sort of discussions of certain parties leaving for some time, and then it sort of that accelerated, I guess, late 25, where the NFP said that they or at least certain members of the NFP party, said that they no longer wished to partake in the Government of Provincial Unity, the GPU in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, I think it's important here to emphasize that there is one member of the executive committee, Mbali Shinga, who initially had the post of social development. Now, my understanding of this situation is, getting back to, I guess, answer your question directly, a kind of a form of brinksmanship. It looks like it could be that to a great extent. Now, the leader of the party, a fellow called Ivan Barnes, it appears that he, or perhaps other members within that NFP party, instructed Mbali Shinga to vote against the Premier in a motion of no confidence, which I think was in December, I believe, 2025. Now she didn't do that. She voted with the GPU, with the ANC, the DA, and Nkada, the IFP. So that motion failed. So what appears to be happening now is, and I read a matter of minutes ago. I don't. Well, time will tell if this is true or what may be the case. But it appears that the Mbali Shinga is now appointed MEC for Health in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a much larger portfolio. The two big provincial portfolios in South Africa are education and health. Those two portfolios combined have the lion's share of the provincial budget. Now, as I say, I read a matter of minutes ago that instead of leaving the GPU altogether, that this party with 0.5% of the vote in KwaZulu-Natal now has the portfolio of health. And that may have been a tactic to achieve a larger portfolio. I don't know who was driving that within the NFP. I can't say. It's not, nor is it for me to say. However, some of the MECs, some of the current MECs on other portfolios did come out and say that Mbali Shinga was a woman of integrity, doing all that she could within what was a troubled portfolio of social development, and that she was very much at odds with the leader of the party, Ivan Barnes, in direction and what the NFP's stance within the GPU would be. So it looks like someone within the party has threatened to leave the GPU, and as a result, they've been given a larger portfolio.
Which could, I mean, that sort of precedent, if that continues, that could set, some kind of pattern going forward. Is this, so you mentioned the formation of the GPU after the elections. Have there been other instances of this level of brinkmanship in KZN or in other provincial coalitions after the elections, or do you think this is the first major one to possibly set some kind of precedent?
Yeah, I think this is the biggest one that I've seen since 24. I guess after 24, you had three provincial coalitions. The Gauteng, obviously, which is a minority government, it seems to have been able to pass budgets, I believe, ANC led with the support of the FF and MK.
And in Johannesburg, they also passed salary increases for councillors. So.
Yeah. That's not for me to comment on, but yeah, the other provincial coalition is actually the Northern Cape, which is the ANC sits on 50% and needs one more vote, and I believe that they have been backed by the Freedom Front Plus in the Northern Cape. That one's kind of gone under the radar a little bit. But by far the most dramatic coalition of the 9 provinces is the province of KwaZulu-Natal. Now, the the way that landed, and I've made a similar point on your show before. MK got 47%, but you can get 47% and still be out of government. The broader opposition can deny you the government, can deny you governance if they're united in purpose and if they're aligned in values and so on. So yeah, that's clearly what's happened here. It's a good case study of, do parties that sort of broadly form what you may call a centrist coalition. If they collectively have 51%, does that tend to hold? Yeah, well, the evidence on that across a lot of the municipalities in South Africa is quite good. So it's holding, it's hanging by a thread, and I said on your show before, against the odds, this may be the one coalition that lasts the full term, because if the NFP switch sides, they still don't have enough to govern with MK and EFF combined. It's just very, very slim and thin mathematics the way it's sort of panned out. So yeah, this probably was brinksmanship all along, and at least it could be seen as that. And they need that. The other three parties need that one vote of that one party in order to pass budgets and so on. So that is, I guess the NFP is in a very strong position, is in a very strong position because they hold the balance of power, and they've been able to exercise that. And there's an argument that some of these smaller parties know how to exercise this better than some of the larger parties across the country, whether it's in municipalities or provinces or at a national level. So yeah, it's fascinating to say the least. Yeah.
Sean, just focusing on a party that relied so much on former President Zuma for their support in KZN and indeed in many parts of the country, the ANC, and given how MK just completely eroded their support in KwaZulu-Natal, took over a lot of their structures wholesale. I mean, what about how the ANC in KZN plays things? So given the number of seats they have, if one looks at some of the tensions between national and provincial ANC structures, so someone like the Secretary General Fikile Mbalula, he's in no uncertain terms talked about the challenges and lack of capacity that the party faces in KZN. Do you think there's an opportunity for MK and the EFF maybe to look at bringing those ANC seats over to their side, either later this year or after the next local government elections? Would they identify the ANC as a weak point in the GPU?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll answer it in a specific way. So ANC got, I think it was 57% of the vote in 2019. So they, if I'm not mistaken, I speak under correction, but I think it was about 57%. Now that fell from 57% to 18%. So that's one hell of a fall. Now, an ANC at 57% is a very, very different thing to an ANC at 17%. Some might say that in this case, a lot of those who were maybe aligned with MK already crossed to MK, or at least that section, that sort of type of person in the party was bleeded out. And what you're left with is a small 17%, dare say what you might call a sort of social democrat party. And in sort of political science terms, that's maybe why the GPU is holding, because the center right has 51%, because the ANC in this case is not a Leviathan mammoth party at 57% broad church with every person from every walk of life to satisfy. So it's much easier to get agreement with 17% of the seats rather than 57% of the seats. Now, I think that could be in time what happens to the ANC nationally. That, let's say the DA goes to 25% or 30% and the ANC falls to 20% or below, it might become a much more coherent party. Now, because it's fallen so far in KwaZulu-Natal, it's about survival, really. And I think that this GPU, what you could effectively do is go through the 4 members of the GPU, go through their relationship with MK and the EFF and see if they'll jump to the other side. Now, the Inkatha Freedom Party, they're not going to jump because they have the premiership. And if they jump, I'm assuming they would lose the premiership, among other portfolios which they want, sort of social, cultural portfolios and so on, which is part of the Inkatha Freedom Party's identity. The ANC had the 2 biggest portfolios of health and education. If what I read today is correct, they don't any longer have health, but that doesn't matter. But the DA, it's their first time governing in provincial government in KwaZulu-Natal, so they're not going to jump, nor would they align with a party like MK, that's kind of ideologically opposed to their governing, their sort of ideology. It's understandable that they would not. So the one that's left is NFP, and as I said before, they don't have the numbers if they did jump across. So yeah, so you could narrow it down to the ANC if it were to be one party that did jump and would give MK the numbers. It would be the ANC. Now, the way that could happen would be through a secret ballot motion of no confidence. Now, one has passed just now in December, so I believe it's 6 months before another one can take place. Not entirely sure about that, but I speak under correction. I believe it's 6 months. But they all in this open ballot in December, they all voted against. They all voted with the premier, or they all voted against the motion. So, that they instinctively understand. I'm sure they instinctively understand that this is about survival as a party in that province. And if they do jump, and all the MECs change, the governance structure changes, potentially the government of KwaZulu-Natal becomes quite shaky, becomes quite, perhaps not governed to the same standard that it is at the moment under an MK government. If that were to come to pass, then they would effectively get the blame for that, and that would scupper their chances possibly of ever governing in KwaZulu-Natal again, where they're effectively eradicated. And I have said on your show before, I still do think it's very possible that come 2029, that the KwaZulu-Natal could be IFP-DA outright without the ANC, i.e. those 2 parties collectively could gain enough to get over the line without the ANC altogether. So the ANC wants to be seen to be in government and to be seen to be doing what it can in the provincial government in order to survive in KwaZulu-Natal. And obviously the knock-on effect, if you effectively cease to exist in KwaZulu-Natal, then that'll have a big impact on your national number as well. So it's about survival, really.
Just a screenshot of the electoral map in 2021. So after the 2021 local government elections, and just the amount of green that was on the map of South Africa, so representing the ANC and the concentration in places like KwaZulu-Natal. But you can only then start seeing erosion in places, even like the Eastern Cape, where one would be surprised. But even there is sort of that ebbing away of support. So if, for example, the ANC really does fall out of government in KZN, the knock-on effect on other provinces, I think, would be quite stark. And I guess number one issue to highlight for the ANC is access to resources and patronage. So if you fall out of provincial government, how restricted you are then in your access to resources that you dole out to friends and through tenders and all that kind of thing. It starts to break up those support networks, I think, and that sort of thing shouldn't be discounted. I'm guessing, Sean, if the ANC does decide to leave or the GPU falls apart for any other reason, the premier, he could still remain the premier, right? It might just be that the province is sort of mired in deadlock and that kind of thing. But it's not guaranteed that he would be ousted. So you might have the sort of dysfunctional or non-functional GPU, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This is the interesting point. So I'm sure the NFP and the ANC have thought about this. At least I very much hope that they have. Now, the premier would have to resign if a motion of no confidence were successful. But I'm not sure if the MECs would all resign and that the executive would effectively fall away, because in order to dissolve the executive and to call fresh elections in a province, I believe that you need 2/3 of the chamber. So that's very unlikely, given the sort of how fragmented the vote is in that province, and we've been through the mathematics of it before. So if the NFP were to jump, then they would still have a minority government, and you would just have changed all the MECs and still have a minority government. That's a very bad thing to do strategically. I don't think it takes a genius to work that out. Now the ANC, I think, would give you those numbers, but I'm not entirely sure how the actual mechanics of it would work in terms of calling a new election. I'm pretty confident no provincial premier in South Africa has been removed through a motion of no confidence, because I believe that you need 2/3 of, as I say, you need 2/3 of the chamber in order for that to happen. There were a couple of motions against Helen Zille when she was premier of the Western Cape, but they didn't succeed. And there's been, I'm sure there's been motions of no confidence brought to other provincial premiers, but ultimately none of them have ever succeeded. So I guess you would need 51% to remove the premier, but then you would need 2/3 to, I believe, call fresh elections, or to be able to effectively reconstitute the province through a fresh election. So it's pretty technical, pretty tough going out there in KwaZulu-Natal at the moment. Now, one thing I wanted to add, I said on your show before, it kind of reminds me of it kind of has the analogy of like a schoolboy, teenagers all sort of staring at each other in a dare. Like you jump over to the other side, and one of them's like, me? No, not me. No, him. He'll do it. And then everyone look at him. Me? No, surely not. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Let's. You know what, lads? Let's just leave it. It's easier. We're better as we'll not jump. We'll just leave it as we are. We're okay as we are. So and then we'll kick the can down the road. We'll talk about this again in another 6 months or a year. Yeah. And then another year goes by, and it might have held together okay, and some changes in portfolios, but ultimately the 51% centrist coalition has held.
I think the teenagers in politics analogy works in many instances. So I'm glad you mentioned that again and bring it up. I think it's useful to keep in mind nowadays. Two more sort of major big questions for you before we close today. So what's your, I don't know if this is a fair question or not, but I'm hosting, so I can ask you unfair questions. What are in MK's prospects here in January of 2026? So, I mean, we started off the discussion setting the context. Their great performance in the 2024 elections. Last year, lots of changes, not least of which in the position of Secretary General. Their representative, their leader in Parliament has changed. So all of that filtering through into how the structures are performing or not performing. What are you tracking or seeing in MK's possible performance or not in KZN specifically in the next local government election?
Yeah, so if you layer the data over, the 2024 was not a local government election; it was national and provincial election. But if you layer that data over by council, by municipality, MK did get a handful of outright majorities in KwaZulu-Natal, and large pluralities in a lot more. So plurality meaning biggest party, but not an outright majority. So 30 or 40 or 45% or something like that, but not 51% or above. Now, the data on by-elections in KwaZulu-Natal is a bit all over the place, and there's some indications that MK are doing very well, some indications that they're doing very poorly. If I were to bet on it, I know you South Africans love the predictions, but I still think they'll take a huge chunk of the vote in KwaZulu-Natal and most of the municipalities. But I don't think they'll do quite as well as what they did in 2024, and I think they'll fall shy of an outright majority in. They may only get an outright majority in a handful of municipalities, and then swathes of others. They'll get the largest share of the vote, and then the broader opposition will be able to deny, if it wants to work together, MK, the council. And that's going to happen across so many councils in KwaZulu-Natal, I would imagine. So you might essentially a replica of what you have in the provincial government, but in the councils. In some of them, the IFP might be the largest, and some of them, the DA might be the largest. Some of them, the ANC might be the largest. The ANC does best kind of the southern part of KwaZulu-Natal on the border with the Eastern Cape. The DA does better, sort of Maritzburg, Msunduzi, and Durban, eThekwini, and slightly to the north of Durban as well, in KwaZulu. And then the IFP has its sort of stronghold around in Nkandla and the sort of central north inland and northeast of KwaZulu-Natal. So, yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting indeed. I guess it really just comes down to the councillors and who they are and what way they want to go. What I don't know is what certain councillors' view is on MK and given rural council in KwaZulu-Natal. That's kind of difficult to know until the results come in and until the coalitions form. So, you might get that the ANC goes in with MK in a lot of these councils, but I think looking at it now, it's fair to say IFP, ANC, DA collectively will have enough if they want to work together to form a majority in many councils across the province.
Surely, question not on KZN specifically, but on the Democratic Alliance. So, given that we had the very public resignation of Deon George, what does that indicate to you in terms of the DA's prospects? Is it significantly hurt them out in the lead up to the local government elections? Do you think it's a bad optic kind of development, or do you think a bit of a struggle and seek up and they'll sort of ride through it?
Yeah. So I think it's always hard to know with the DA. I think it's Gareth Van Onselen makes the point that they've pulled quite high before between elections, and it's hasn't ultimately come pass and to materialize on vote day. I think in 2019 they were polling at 30%, according to Gareth Van Onselen anyway. Not far out from the 2019 election, and of course they regressed in 2019 and got only 20% of the vote. So, you know, you would want, you know, the DA is polling a little bit better, but it's polling sort of mid 20s, high 20s, 30 in some cases. That does seem to be typical of the DA. They poll quite highly between elections, and that tends to fall away a little bit going into the election. I don't know what the reasons for that are. Politics is really difficult. It's not for me to sort of unnecessarily criticize anybody or any political party, but you know, you do need to be certain members of the party do need to be careful what they say going, you know, into an election, because that's when all eyes are on the media and on people and what they say, and people remember those things when things are fresh in their minds. But look, there'll be municipal level polling coming out this year, and I think there are a handful of municipalities that I'm looking at where I think the DA does stand to do very well. And if they don't get an outright majority, well, then they'll at least have got enough to get workable coalitions. And the ANC will have fallen so far that those coalitions, those kingmakers within those coalitions will have a much harder time going over to the ANC because they've fallen so far. So, yeah, look, you know, I don't think we have time to get into the individual sort of cities or councils necessarily, but that's how I would summarize it, yeah.
I think we definitely will later in the year. We're going to dive a lot deeper into a lot more of the provinces, not least of which Gauteng and the Western Cape. But we're going to dive into, I think, some of the metros, Johannesburg, you know, given how through that particular race could be with Helen Zille throwing her hat into the ring. There's lots more for us to think about and understand in domestic, local South African politics throughout this year. The next local government elections, I think the earliest need to happen by November and by the latest January of 2027. So we're going to dive up to that with a lot more analysis from you, Sean, from many others. So on that note, I'm going to wrap us up. Sean, I really appreciate your time with the CRA today. All of you who joined us for this lunchtime discussion, I really do appreciate it. And as I said, we'll be back with a lot more from the CRA in terms of domestic, political and economic analysis, as well as on the global geopolitical front. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Centre for Risk Analysis. Take care.